You see a gunslinger emerge from a desert's shimmering horizon. He looks like the tight-lipped, cigar-chewing sharpshooter of Hang 'em High, or maybe from Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. And when you look at it on paper, High Plains Drifter certainly reads like your typical Clint Eastwood Western. You see, it's a story of a mysterious, crackshot out-of-towner who's paid handsomely to protect this ideal California mining community from outlaws. This was basically standard fare for Eastwood in the 1973 era. In reality, though, the film, which is only the second one that Eastwood is behind the lens in, is pretty atypical. High Plains Drifter is a blackly comedic movie, basically made when Eastwood was still considered little more than a conservative prop with a gun. It's a keenly spiritual film with such high themes as the corrosive power of violence on its mind. The film was done in 1973, and it was written by Ernest Tiedemann and produced by Robert Daly for Clint Eastwood's Malpaso Company and Universal Pictures. This film was greatly influenced by the work of Eastwood's two major collaborators, that being film director Sergio Leone and Don Siegel. In addition to Eastwood, the film also stars Verna Bloom, Mariana Hill, Mitchell Ryan, Jack Ging, and Stefan Garash. The film was shot on location on the shores of Mono Lake, California. D. Barton wrote the film score. Now, Universal Pictures really wanted the film to be shot on a studio lot, but instead Clint Eastwood had a whole town built in this desert town of Mono Lake in the California Sierras. Many of the buildings that were constructed there were three-dimensional, not just facades, and this was done so that the interior shots could be shot on location too. Clint Eastwood actually scouted the locations himself while driving a pickup truck through Oregon, Nevada, and California. He chose the shores of Mono Lake because he considered the area highly photogenic. Additional scenes were filmed in Reno, Nevada, and also in California's Inyo National Forest. Now, the town of Lago is actually 300 miles from Hollywood, and it was constructed by a 46-man crew of technicians and laborers who worked 10-hour days for 18 days straight constructing the 14 houses and the two-story hotel. Once filming was completed, they actually burned the entire set down. Now, they actually did the editing for the movie in a log cabin on the shores of Mono Lake, pretty close to the location of the town they built. The strange colors make the town of Lago look different throughout the day scenes. He also supplemented this with eerie music and weird dream sequences that all added to the supernatural atmosphere of the movie. Another interesting thing about the filming process in this movie is that he filmed everything in sequence. It was all done in order, and that's rarely done in Hollywood. Now, it actually takes about 7 minutes for the film to elapse before Clint Eastwood actually says a word of dialogue, and this is despite him being in the movie from the very first frame. Now, the stranger that he plays is pretty similar to the man with no name persona that's familiar to the Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, and they even wear a similar hat. The character in this movie has no personal name and is only referred to in the billing as the stranger. Any holes that they came across in the plot were filmed with black humor, an allegory to Sergio Leone. Eastwood thought the allegory of this movie was a speculation on what happens when they go ahead and kill the sheriff and someone comes back and calls the town's conscience to bear. There's always retribution for your deeds. Now, if you notice, the Bible verse on the wall of the church is Isaiah 53, verse 3 and 4, which reads, He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteem him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Now the character of Marshal Jim Duncan, the man that gets whipped to death in the middle of the town, is played by stuntman Buddy Van Horn, a longtime stunt coordinator for Clint Eastwood. And they used his face in this to make it somewhat confusing, or whether he was a different person or the stranger that had ridden into town. Clint Eastwood commented one time during an interview at the Actors Studio in 1994 that the earlier versions of the script made the stranger the dead marshal's brother, but Clint Eastwood actually favored a less explicit and more supernatural interpretation of this character. There was a possible alternate ending that would have seen the stranger, after riding away back into the desert wilderness and saying goodbye to Mordecai, he appears confused and suffering from memory loss and doesn't actually remember arriving or leaving Lago, and he rides to points unknown. That ending would have indicated that the stranger had been possessed by the ghost of Marshal Jim Duncan, and why the stranger doesn't remember Lago, Mordecai, Callie Travers, and the story of Marshal Duncan's murder or anything, and Duncan's spirit has left his body and is now at peace. And this means that his death has been avenged. It's kind of interesting that one of the headstones in the graveyard actually has the name Sergio Leone as a tribute to the great director. There are also other headstones that bear the name of Don Siegel, who is Clint Eastwood's director on 5 movies. And also in that graveyard is Brian Hutton, the director of Where Eagles Dare and Kelly's Heroes. Clint Eastwood's quoted as saying that he likes to bury his directors. Now, this was a pretty controversial film for its day, and you can kind of understand why. This is a revisionist Western that doesn't hold the same cues or the same standards as a normal Western. You see Clint Eastwood in a rape scene, which is unbelievable in itself, but the movie was still a big commercial hit, and it's listed in the Motion Picture Guide as one of the best Westerns of the 70s. Some of the critics were kind of harsh on Eastwood's direction, and they just stated that they thought that he was copying too much of Don Siegel's work and Sergio Leone. I look at that as you're just learning from people and you're going to imitate the best, and that's basically what he's done. I don't see anything wrong with that. The film actually holds the 11th position as the highest grossing of the 1970s Westerns. Now, the amount of paint that they actually used to paint the Western town was actually 380 gallons. In the movie, he asked for 200 gallons, but in actuality, they used 380 gallons to paint this town red. And they actually used 150,000 feet of timber to build the town of Lago. And Lago actually translates in Spanish to lake or body of water. The majority of the film was shot in the daytime. There were only 3 sections of this movie that were shot at night. And Clint Eastwood is in the last 4 minutes of the movie, but he's basically absent in much of the climax of the movie. Now, shortly after the movie's release, Clint Eastwood actually wrote to John Wayne, and he suggested that they make a Western together. John Wayne actually sent back a very angry letter in reply, in which he basically denounced this movie for its violence and its revisionist portrayal of the Old West. Clint Eastwood didn't even bother to answer his criticisms, and consequently, they never did work together. John Wayne did not like this style of movie at all, where you basically take the bad guy, turn him into a good guy, but he's still a bad guy at heart. These revisionist westerns always had so much gray area in them. The John Wayne westerns were cut and dry. They were either black or white. You were good or bad. And that's the way John Wayne saw westerns and felt like they always should be. He was definitely old school about it. That's where he came from. Now, I have to tell you, I really enjoy this movie. I think it's a well-done movie, especially because it's only Clint Eastwood's second directorial effort. I think he does an amazing job at it. The movie is somewhat dark, but it's still an enjoyable watch. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.